The Thälmann Battalion was a battalion of the International Brigades in the Spanish Civil War. It was named after the imprisoned German communist leader Ernst Thälmann and included approximately 1,500 people, mainly Germans, Austrians, Swiss and Scandinavians. The battalion fought in the defense of Madrid. Amongst the commanders of the battalion were the German writer, historian and World War I officer Ludwig Renn and Prussian World War I officer Hans Kahle, later promoted to lead the Republican 45th Division for a time. The battalion, like the International Brigades in general, also attracted its share of intellectuals, such as the well-known writer Willy Breedel, who became its commissar. German volunteers. The German-speaking battalions were one of the first and eventually largest groups that formed in the International Brigades, coalescing out of the Thälmann centuria of the early war days. Most of the Germans volunteering were working-class people, members of the Weimar Republic's lost generation, who had never known stability or regular employment, and to many, the simple arrival in Spain to join the fight on the Republic's side was the first victory after years of losing the political struggle at home. In the home countries of Germany and Austria, fascism had already conquered, giving the foreign struggle a special grim context. As Robert G. Colodny writes in the International Brigades, the history of the Germans in Spain is the history of strong men who proved and overproved the courage and endurance, the resistance to pessimism and despair. It is the story of men who died or were broken physically in doing this. They brought to the International Brigades an offensive spirit, a bitter desperate courage at rare intervals in war, priceless, essential, but always costly. They set an early example of what shock troops could be like. They tried to do the impossible, and paid for it, and during the early days inarrogant, in the futile fighting around Huesca, at Tardinta, the Germans, in countless bayonet charges against fortified positions, took their objectives, buried the dead, and waited with a caged restlessness for the next day's orders. John Cornford, an English communist and poet, echoed these thoughts, describing the Germans as, quote, the finest people in some ways I have ever met. In a way they have lost everything, have been through enough to break most people, and remain strong and cheerful and humorous. If anything is revolutionary, it is these comrades. Ernest Hemingway went even further in his admiration, calling them representative of the true Germany and contrasting them unfavorably with the Germans fighting on the other side in the Legion Condor. The respect with which the Germans were accorded by the others in the International Brigades, as well as by the Republican populace, lifted the spirits as well. Many of them had been stripped of the nationality by the Nazis, and had spent years underground or in exile, and the war gave them the opportunity to reclaim an anti-fascist identity, the vision of a better Germany. For many it was also a time of either communist reaffirmation or political enlightenment. However, the German volunteers were not above human faults and despair, especially as the war dragged on, and got increasingly difficult for the Republican side, which lacked the plentiful supplies and superior organization of the nationalist opponents. Records show that about 1/10 of the volunteers eventually found themselves imprisoned at least for a certain duration for crimes like desertion, breaking discipline, or for political reasons as the Stalinist tendency in the brigades increased, infighting between anarchists and communists, eventually resulting in outright battles with several hundred dead and the purging of rival communist groups like the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. Also further poisoned the atmosphere as Francisco Franco's victory came closer. The Thälmann Battalion was memorialized in song by G. Kabisch and Paul Dessau, and famously recorded by Ernst Busch. World War II partisan battalion in the former Yugoslavia. On August 8, 1943, a Thälmann Battalion was founded in West Slavonia as an ethnic German unit within Tito's partisan army in the former Yugoslavia. It was composed mainly of German army deserters and local ethnic Germans led by Commander Hans Pichler and Johann Mucker, a Swedish communist in the interwar period. As political commissar, Mucker's son was killed by Ustashi on March 13, 1942, and later earned the honor of People's Hero after the war. The battalion comprised roughly 200 men and was refreshed from Swedish recruits from Croatia and the Serbian Banat. It remained a separate unit with its own Germanic black, red, and gold insignia. It is said that Tito ordered that it not be engaged in combat against German army units. In the end, it was nearly destroyed in an engagement against heavily armored units at Mikias in November 1943, but continued to exist with some replacements. It was used often for its propaganda value. It adopted its own version of the Spanish Civil War song, the Thälmann Colonnade.